Hi, I'm Charles McFarland, and this is the second in a series of programs about the great benefits that science has given us and the great changes that science has forced us to make. Most of the important events of the last 2 centuries have been caused by developments in science and technology. Humanity has had to change patterns of behavior which were developed in the agricultural age. The changes have often been painful and difficult. However, as was suggested at the end of the last program, the changes have led to a new era of cooperation and tolerance. The changes have begun to fulfill the ideals of Jesus, Mohammed, Buddha, and other great leaders of the distant past. This program is about the changes that have resulted from the Industrial Revolution. That was the time, about 200 years ago, when humanity shifted from agricultural society, which we can call Ag-Soc, to science and technology, which we can call Sci-Tech. One major change of the last 2 centuries has been the development of democracy. In Ag-Soc, democracy was generally not possible. If you think of the ancient world, or the Middle Ages, most of the common people were involved in agriculture, and they could only produce just enough to keep everybody alive. There was very little surplus wealth, or free time, to dedicate to education. Most people were ignorant, and couldn't even read or write. They did not have enough education to demand democracy, or to participate well, even if they did get it. Democracy was not possible under such conditions. To be sure, there were flashes of democracy, such as in Athens and the Roman Republic. These democracies, however, were limited. Only wealthy people could vote, and only men. Even so, the democracies soon broke down. With the technology of the time, voting just wasn't a practical way to make decisions. Kings and emperors soon took over. It wasn't until Sci-Tech came along that democracy became practical. Science and technology brought increasing prosperity, which meant more people could go to school and become educated. The process was reciprocal. As more and more people became educated, science progressed faster too. It was no accident that democracy progressed fastest in England, because that is where the Industrial Revolution started. Parliament started to take control of government in the late 18th century. The United States, a new country, started democracy about the same time. France had a revolution and tried to implant democracy, but the ruling establishment was too strong, and it took another 100 years or so for democracy to flourish. Democracy has been gradually expanding ever since. In the beginning, in England, only wealthy white men had the vote. By the middle of the 19th century, all white men had the vote. Women campaigned for the vote in the late 19th century and early 20th. Blacks in the United States also had a long and difficult struggle, but finally triumphed in recent times. The struggle for various nations was equally hard. When George Washington was elected president, he was the only elected leader in the world. The British Prime Minister was elected, but he still shared power with his king. We tend to forget that even when Abraham Lincoln was elected, 72 years later, he was still the only elected leader of a major nation, though the British Prime Minister, with Queen Victoria on the throne, was slowly gaining. In fact, it wasn't until the Treaty of Versailles, after World War I, that all the Western nations had elected leaders. Some nations still had monarchs, as the British do today. But democracy had finally gained control. The expansion of democracy has been going on ever since, generally linked with Sci-Tech. In Europe, it took place only with considerable struggle. The French, as we said, struggled to implant democracy for most of the 19th century. The chaos of World War I helped Germany, Austria, and Russia to throw off their kings and emperors. But Russia, the least advanced in Sci-Tech, lapsed back into despotism. Struggles for democracy took place all over Europe, especially in the revolutions of 1848 and 1870. And similar struggles continued through the 20th century. Even today, some countries that have not advanced with sci-tech are still trying to advance into democracy. The second major change of the last 2 centuries has been the development of capitalism. Capitalism was born with sci-tech. Science and technology created complex enterprises for humanity, like building factories and launching ships. Such enterprises required lots of capital, often more than one person could supply. Corporations were born. The first corporations were started in Holland, in shipping. Dutch burghers started building large ships, which could voyage to the Far East for trade. The ships were too large for most people to own, and anyway it could be financial suicide to own the whole of one boat in such a risky business. The Dutch hit upon the idea of sharing the risk. The burghers would share the cost of a ship. That way, if the ship foundered, it would not be a financial catastrophe for anyone. These shares are the origin of the share market today. Unfortunately, the spread of capitalism caused even more struggles than the spread of democracy. The problem was that sci-tech generally required huge enterprises, things like factories, ships, railways, and power plants. These were owned sometimes by individuals, sometimes by corporations, but generally by only a few people. Much larger numbers of people were employed as workers. Thus began the friction between owners and employees, between capital and labor. Who was to get the huge profits that science and technology provided? For example, the first cloth mills used machinery and the power provided by rivers or steam engines to make huge quantities of cloth. This was much more efficient than individual cloth makers working in their cottages, and huge profits were made. The men who grabbed the new technology and took the risk of building the mills could make a fortune. The mills employed huge numbers of the former cottage workers. The big question was, how much of the fortune should go to them? It was a complex and emotional issue. The whole union movement devolved from it. How long should people work? And what should they be paid? And what safety requirements should protect them? These were questions that sometimes convulsed the 19th and 20th centuries. We still inherit them. One extreme answer was to try to eliminate the gulf between workers and owners entirely, by making the workers the owners. In short, communism. Taken up by Russia in 1917, that solution caused convulsions in history for most of the 20th century, until it failed. Struggles between workers and owners still go on. Science and technology required people to make serious changes in their ways of living. Some of these changes, like democracy, have pretty well been completed. The struggles of labor against capital and the problems of regulating capitalism are not quite so finished. A third change, the most important of all, is not finished at all. This is the problem of war. Science and technology have made war extremely dangerous. As we saw in the first video, this was already true in 1914, when World War I began. It's even truer now. Even more than being dangerous, war is fundamentally stupid. It wasn't always so. In ancient times, in the Middle Ages, and up to about 1800, war was an attractive proposition. A strong king, with good soldiers, could gain a lot of wealth and territory by attacking other countries and taking them over. History is full of stories of successful wars by Julius Caesar, Charlemagne, and Alexander, to name just a few. They changed the world, sometimes for the better, as well as making themselves great. Wars were successful because land was the main source of wealth. The peasants just kept on farming the land under the new ruler. They had no choice, and were generally too ignorant to object much, as long as the new ruler didn't treat them harshly. Sometimes the conqueror ruled wisely, like Cyrus the Great of Persia, or Genghis Khan, and created a great civilization in his new empire. The Romans created a great civilization wherever they conquered lands. Other rulers were not so wise, but in any case, there wasn't much the conquered people could do to resist. That too ended with sci-tech. The educated people of modern times put up a lot more resistance to conquerors. With modern sci-tech weapons, they can make conquest practically impossible. When Hitler tried to take over France, he encountered huge resistance. The tiny nation of Vietnam gave the USA just as much trouble. No longer is it possible to march into someone else's country and take it over, even if all you want is to remove an objectionable government. The USA is learning that the hard way in several countries. War, like slavery, has become a silly idea. Hitler caused nothing but misery trying to subdue France, and worse in Russia. The United States did equally badly in Vietnam. World War I was the watershed. Europe had no wars for nearly 100 years after Napoleon, while sci-tech was developing deadlier and deadlier weapons. But people clung to their old ideas. They still saw war as a good way for nations to conquer and triumph. By all accounts, World War I was a disaster, not only for the losers, but for everyone in it. The number of French soldiers killed or wounded was equal to 1/10 of the entire population of France. The number of German soldiers killed outright was equal to 1/20 of the entire population of Germany. Great Britain lost 20,000 young men killed on a single day, July 1st, 1916, in the Battle of the Somme, and 40,000 more wounded on that terrible day. Worse still, the young men killed were often the best and brightest of their generation, the natural leaders, the idealistic ones, who volunteered and went out first. Millions of others were maimed or injured for life, and even those who were untouched were often emotionally shattered by the horror of the trenches. The economic cost was enormous, and standards of living all over Europe were much lower after the war. And the war was fought almost completely for nothing. Within 21 years, the same countries were at each other's throats again, often on the same battlefields. The reason was they clung to their egg sock ideas. They thought war was glorious and entitled them to spoils. The Allies stripped Germany of some of its territory and all of its colonies after World War I. They demanded huge reparations, not only money, but anything else they could take, like airplanes, zeppelins, resources of all kinds, and even abstract booty like patents. The result was poverty all over Germany and widespread resentment. The United States made things worse by not supporting the League of Nations. Germany struggled back toward prosperity in the 1920s, but then rampant speculation in the United States started the Great Depression of 1929. That brought Hitler into power, with his defiance of the Allies and his rearming for war. World War II is often seen as a just war, but it was really caused by the Allies and their ag-sock vindictiveness. They believed in crushing the enemy rather than cooperating for mutual success. The disaster of World War I was caused because people clung to their ag-sock ideals. They believed that war was glorious. They believed in conquering other lands. They believed that war was the way for a nation to be great. But in sci-tech, what's important is ideas. Ideas can be shared. What's good for your neighbor is good for you. When people share the ideas of sci-tech, everyone is better off. Just look at the USA and Japan. Which is better, sharing digital electronics or fighting at Pearl Harbor? The wonderful thing is that the USA learned that after World War II. The USA launched the Marshall Plan and helped the former enemies to recover. The result was that Germany and Japan became America's strongest allies. The friendship and cooperation continue to this day. Wonderful things happen when people adjust to sci-tech. But war is still a problem. Many people still cling to the old idea that war is good, that it can somehow achieve something. Some people would rather die than change their obsolete ideas. With war, many people do. Science and technology support tolerance and cooperation. Democracy means people working together for the common good. Capitalism and corporations, when not abused, mean the same thing. The greatest and last change we need to make for sci-tech will be abandoning war for the great good we can achieve together.